Hey, welcome back. This is Dr. Joel Duff. Today's excursion into biology has us examining a real-world case of natural selection in action. In order to do so, we're going to be exploring the fascinating world of cliff swallows, and we're going to be looking at how these birds may be adapting to the increasing numbers of automobiles on our roads. Cliff swallows are a type of passerine bird, which includes all of the perching birds that are found in North America and South America. They're known for their distinctive mud nest, which they build on the faces of cliffs and other vertical surfaces. However, as human beings have constructed buildings and road overpasses, these birds have frequently found themselves taking advantage of those things and building nests on those human structures, bringing them into much closer contact with us and, more importantly, our automobiles. Like other birds, they are vulnerable to collisions with cars, which cause significant mortality among cliff swallow populations. To look at this problem, we're going to examine a fascinating research paper from 2013, which reports evidence that cliff swallows in Nebraska may be adapting to this new automobile-rich environment that they live in by reducing the length of their wings. Is this evolution in action that we're witnessing? We will discuss this and how we might test and observe natural selection in natural populations coming up. All right, here's our organism of interest, the cliff swallow. You need to know a couple things about their biology before we can discuss the paper. One is, as I mentioned in the introduction, cliff swallows make mud nests. So they construct their nest out of mud that they collect. So they build these mud nests on usually vertical surfaces. And so that's where they get their name, the cliff swallow. The other thing you need to know is they build these in large colonies. So this isn't solitary nests. These are tens to usually hundreds of different nests. And so they aggregate together and then build these nests right next to each other. So there ends up being hundreds of nests compacted together in one place. The third thing you need to know about them is that cliff swallows, they eat insects, and they eat a wide variety of insects. But the most important thing about these insects is that they're flying insects. Swallows are birds that will swoop across a field, swoop across meadows and across water bodies, and they literally catch their prey in flight and eat those prey in flight, much like a dragonfly. And so this is their manner for collecting food, and we're going to be talking about cliff swallow roadkill, sadly. And so they're swooping across fields, and they're going to get hit once in a while by an automobile flying by. So with those things in mind, we're going to ask this question. If automobiles are new to this world, relatively speaking to cliff swallows, which have been around for a long time, and now cliff swallows live in this environment where you have these fast-moving vehicles traveling horizontally and potentially coming into contact with their flight paths. You might expect that cliff swallows may get hit once in a while. And if it's a fairly frequent number, that could have an impact on their populations, right? And so if there is a significant impact on their population, in other words, if it increases mortality to the rate that many cliff swallows can no longer reproduce, that could potentially reduce the size of the population. All right. So automobiles, we would say, could potentially have a very strong negative fitness, right? Affect the fitness of these organisms. So, but do they? All right. Is there actual observational data that suggests that this happens, that cliff swallows are impacted by automobiles? And then more importantly, is there any evidence that we could identify from nature and from these cliff swallows themselves that suggests the cliff swallows are adapting to the presence of automobiles in their environment? You can think of it this way. The automobiles are a new challenge to them, right? They are a new environmental factor that didn't exist in the past. And so all organisms are confronted at some point with new environmental challenges, in this case, automobiles. And the question for any organism or any species is, how are they going to overcome or adapt to that particular new obstacle in their environment? And so let's ask some basic questions about this. First, we want to say that it is possible that cliff swallows are adapting to the presence of automobiles in their environment. So here's two different hypotheses, very broad hypotheses that could be tested. One is we might hypothesize that they have changed their behavior. Cliff swallows may be learning to avoid flying near roads and highways, where they're more likely to encounter automobiles. This could involve changing migration patterns, foraging behavior, or maybe their nesting habits, like moving farther away from roads. An alternative hypothesis would be that they have changed their actual physical characteristics via, say, genetic changes over time. So certain genetic variations might provide cliff swallows with an advantage in avoiding automobiles. And these variations then might become more common over time. For example, cliff swallows might be developing longer or shorter wings or more agile flight patterns, which would help them avoid collisions with automobiles more easily, and therefore increase their ability to survive those interactions with automobiles. Hence, if they survive, they're going to have more offspring, and they're going to pass those particular genes that allowed them to avoid that automobile down to the next generation. In essence, we're talking about natural selection. We're talking about how natural selection happens. So the paper that we're going to look at, that's going to bring us some data that we can use to address a variety of different hypotheses, is this really very short paper published in Current Biology in 2013 by Charles Brown and Mary Brown. And they have this paper called, "Where Has All the Roadkill Gone?" And they begin their introduction in much the same way that I just started talking. There is 80 million birds that are killed, that's an estimate, by colliding with vehicles on just U.S. roads alone each year. All right? Millions more die in other countries and elsewhere. Losses to vehicles, therefore, appear to be a serious problem. And so if a serious problem for birds in terms of their survival. And so you might expect, as I say, we might expect natural selection to favor individuals that either learn to avoid cars, we just mentioned that, behavioral changes, or have other traits that make them less likely to collide with vehicles. If so, the frequency of roadkill should decline over time. Right? If birds are adapting, if they're learning about cars, they're changing their behavior or they're changing their actual physical attributes to allow them to escape interactions with vehicles, then we should actually witness in the real world a decrease in the number of roadkill that are occurring, the number of birds that are dying over time. So in this paper, what they do is they report on a 30-year-long study in which they are studying a number of different things about cliff swallows. Right, so they've been tracking cliff swallows in this particular area in Nebraska, in southwestern Nebraska, for a very long time, and they've been doing it consistently the same way. They've basically been monitoring the populations, doing population estimates, going out and doing collections each year, measuring various attributes of these cliff swallows. And while they're doing all this activity and they're already traveling the roads and they're going and finding these cliff swallow nests, and then they're counting up the number of nests each year and sort of estimating how many offspring they're having and so forth, right? They're looking at population parameters. As they're traveling the roads, they also notice dead birds on the side of the road, right? And so they do collections, or at least identify what they see on the side of the road, probably more things than just cliff swallows, but for this particular paper, they're talking about the cliff swallows that they found. And so they have a database of the number of roadkill that they've identified each year for 30 years. So they are uniquely situated in a position to be able to answer, provide an answer to this question potentially. Is roadkill actually being reduced over time? And if it is, could that potentially be evidence that the birds themselves have adapted to having cars around? There's a lot of ifs here, and there's a lot of other possible explanations, and we're going to run through some of those, including ones that the authors of this paper didn't even talk about. Some things I've thought of that I think that could be testable as well. All right, I think we just get right to the data. It's a really simple paper, 2-page paper, and they just present most of their evidence in this one figure. And so here's the most relevant information. Let's start up here. Let me get my pen out. Let's start up here in the top in figure 1A. We've got roadkills and numbers of nests. So the first question is, are roadkills going up, staying flat, or being reduced over time? And the answer to that is roadkills have gone down over time. So the number of observed roadkills has gone down consistently, rather remarkably. This is actually pretty clear data that the roadkill numbers have gone down. Now you might be saying, aha, well, what about, okay, so they're not finding as many birds. Maybe they weren't looking as hard some years. Maybe recently there's been budget cuts and they haven't had as many people driving as many hours on the road, and so therefore you're not going to find as many birds. We'll get to that. They actually have calculated, and they have all the data in terms of the amount of time, the number of hours on the road, the number of miles that they've looked at, and so forth. And so we can answer that question. I'll get to that later. Just the first rough look at just that piece of data suggests there are fewer roadkill over time. At least this is fewer roadkill have been found on roads in this particular area of southwestern Nebraska. Now, interestingly, on the same graph, they're mapping the number of total nests, which is a way of estimating total population size. And so here we have number of nests going from somewhere around 10,000 nests in this county in 1984 to up here we see the most recent count in 2012 before they published the paper. They found 25,000 nests. All right, so 10,000 to 25,000 nests. So a population increase of more than double. All right, 2.5 times the number of individuals in the population in this particular area from 30 years ago to present. That tells us the populations are increasing over time. Now that's interesting. That one graph is interesting because it says here's the population going up and yet the roadkills are going down. So one thing you might have said initially when I said roadkills went down, you might say, well, what if the population was just like decreasing all the time? Like maybe there's just not as many birds to be killed on the road. But this clearly suggests that's not the problem, right? That's not the solution. There's more birds around, in fact, and so you would predict, based on the number of nests, the population size, you would predict that roadkill should be going up, and yet you find the roadkills are going down. I'm pretty sure this is probably the thing that somebody noticed in the data sets they have, because they have probably a lot of data sets about a lot of different things that they've been looking at. But somebody noticed, wait a second, we got these populations that are constantly increasing, and yet we have roadkill that we find fewer and fewer roadkill. That's a really interesting trend. How can we explain that? There must be an explanation for that. It seems like a clear piece of data that begs for an explanation. All right, so let's look at, let's go down to C first. All right, roadkills versus the population. Oh, no, we better go to B. Let's go in the order that it's in. There's a reason for that. Let's look at percentage of birds that and their wing length. All right, so now what they're doing is they're looking at the population at large. They had 134 birds. These are birds that were killed in mist netting. So they do collections of birds. They're trapping birds in order to measure characteristics. And sometimes in their trapping, the birds get caught in the nest in such a way that they die, and then they can take a full set of data on them. And so here they have 134 birds. It turns out there's about equal numbers of males and females. They're looking at adult birds. And they measure the wing lengths on them. They measured a lot of things, but we're just going to, really in this paper, they're just talking about wing length. So they look at the wing length of those birds. And those represent birds from all over the place, right? And so that is sort of an estimate of like, what's the average length of the bird wings in the population? And then they looked at the roadkill birds, right? All of the different roadkill birds are some of those roadkill birds, right? And they asked, what's the length of the wing lengths there? And this doesn't have nearly the dramatic flare that that figure A has. But what we see is we see these taller dark bars over here, and these are longer wing lengths. So you see 111 millimeters, 113 millimeters, 108 millimeters. So 2 millimeter difference, but nonetheless you have taller black bars over here on the longer wing length, and the population at large has shorter wing lengths. So let's move from figure B, all right, 1B to 1C. And in 1C, we see this same data actually, but just in a different format, in which we see that roadkill birds have wing lengths measured that have increased somewhat over time, whereas the general population, or the average of the population, their average wing length, at one time was larger than those that were killed and has decreased over time, such that if you have an entire population of birds now and you measure their wing lengths, there's going to be all kinds of variation. But a lot of that variation is wing lengths that are smaller than that average, and then some that are larger. And then it seems like the ones with the largest wings are the ones most likely to be killed by automobiles. Now, we call that potentially a selective force, right? That the automobiles are killing those birds that have larger wings. And if they do that, and those wings, the reason why they're longer is because they have slightly different genetics, right? They have different alleles that allow those birds to grow slightly longer wings during their lifespan. And if more of those are being killed than the ones with shorter wingspans, then those short wingspans ones survive, they reproduce, they pass their particular genes down to the next generation, and the next generation will have shorter wingspans. So the average of the population will decrease over time if you keep taking out the larger ones. We're going to call that directional selection when I get to that, and we talk generally about this. And so this is the observation, all right? This is the evidence, right, that was collected. Now, does this necessarily suggest that that swallows are being selected in such a way that over time they are adapting, right, to the presence of automobiles, right? It's not adaptation is not an organism, an individual looks around in the environment and says, oh, there's a car over there. I need to change the way that I do things, right? I need to grow a shorter wing so that I can avoid that particular car. No, what happens is there's a population, lots of individuals living at one moment in time, and some of them have characteristics that allow them to survive better in that particular environment. That particular environment is an environment with cars. And if the cars are taking out certain members of the population preferentially, right, the cars are more likely to kill certain birds with certain characteristics, you can expect that those characteristics then won't be represented at as high a frequency in future populations. And that will have an effect on the overall, what we call the population genetics of that population over time, such that the population genetics will change over time, which is one of the basic definitions of what evolution is changing allele frequencies over time. All right, so let's delve into this a little bit further, because you might still look at this and you say, like, well, how do I know that this is a direct effect of natural selection, right? Where in this case, what is the selector? The selector is automobiles, right? The automobiles are selecting for features in the bird population and therefore causing the bird population to change. In a way, the way we talk about adaptation is like, we talk about as if the birds are adapting, as if the individual birds, like I just said, are somehow seeing what's around them and they are adapting themselves, or like consciously doing that. As opposed to there's a selective agent, the cars, which are selecting, individuals in the population to survive or not to survive. And as a result, the population changes in the next generation. And we look at that and we say, oh, the population has adapted to that particular situation, that environmental challenge, which would be cars driving through. How might wing length, all right? So in the paper they discuss what might be going on here. What's their hypothesis to explain their data? Their hypothesis is that shortened wing length allows for more maneuverability and quicker takeoffs. So it turns out cliff swallows do hang around on roads. And one of the reasons it might hang around on roads is because you got cars that are also smashing into insects, right? So there's going to be some dead insects lying on the road, recently dead, and that's a great place to collect something to eat. And so you might have birds that are sitting on roads. Well, then you have a car coming by at 50, 60, or 80 or 90 miles an hour in remote Nebraska. And the bird sees it and it has to take off, and it has to have a certain, has to lift off the ground and then hopefully swerve off to one way or the other, or go straight up, right? It has to make some kind of decision there. Longer wings are great for more long distance flying, which the birds do have to do because they're going to migrate in the wintertime. And they're also better for gliding and maybe more energy efficient, which would also aid in their long distance travel, but that's also important locally. But unfortunately, they also make it harder to lift off the ground quite as quickly, and they're not as maneuverable. All right. So, and if it's just lifting off the ground and making a really quick turn to get off to the side, that couple millimeters in length might end up being a significant difference in terms of the number of milliseconds you have in order to escape that car coming at you. And so the shorter winged birds are being able to escape these encounters with cars. All right, that's the hypothesis. Right? We could have other hypotheses. You could say that birds with longer wings also, maybe that longer wing somehow is, that trait is linked to some other behavior where they're more likely to sit in, maybe a bird with a longer wing is more likely to sit in the road. Even though it's more dangerous for it, maybe they're more likely to sit in the road. And if that's the case, or fly over roads. And if that's the case, well, then those are the ones that are going to get killed by automobiles. And it doesn't have anything to do with the wing length. It has to do with some other behavior. I don't think that this is let's explore some of these other hypotheses. All right, so in the supplemental figures, we have some other variables that you might consider. All right, first one, here's supplemental figure number 1. Visitors on holiday weekends. They wanted to know, maybe you could say, why are there fewer roadkill? Because that's really the question they were interested in originally, was how come roadkill has gone down? There might be other human reasons why it's gone down. It's not that the birds have adapted, right? The birds are doing what the birds have done. They're basically the same birds. They really haven't changed very much, and it's something that we've changed in the environment that is causing roadkill to go down. So they addressed that, right? They wanted to remove all those possibilities, which then would increase the possibility that the hypothesis that the birds are actually the ones changing is the correct hypothesis. So here, for example, visitors on holiday weekends, they noted that since 1984 through 2012, there's been about the same number of visitors on Memorial Day, but more importantly, July 4th, which is more like during the time when the birds are more active in that area, and they've migrated up. There's actually increased numbers of individuals traveling in this area. And if there's more cars on the road, what would you expect? You would expect more roadkill. But I just showed you the roadkill is very dramatically decreased over time. And so this is contrary to that hypothesis. Down here we have total annual visitors to the region, and they only had data from 1992 forward, but you can see there's an upward trajectory of total number of visitors to the region. Here we have number of kilometers traveled. So they asked the question about their own research. Like, how many actual kilometers have we traveled across these roads over time? They've been going over 30 years to the same locations. They've been taking the same roads. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but in just designing a research project, you can't just do whatever you want. Go to this one first and go that in the afternoon. You go the next day and go to this particular place in the morning. No, it might be the time of day is important. It might be the order you do things in. The most important thing is you do everything consistently. And so they traveled down the same roads, visited the same locations, the same times of day usually, did their counts of how many nests there were, how many observations they had, and then along the way, they're picking up roadkill. And so they asked themselves, how many total kilometers did we travel? Because one could say, why is there less roadkill? It's because our budget got cut in 1996. And as a result, we only visited half as many times as we did before. And therefore, we didn't travel as many miles. Well, of course, if you don't travel as many miles, you're not going to find as many roadkill. Even if the number of roadkill was the same over time, you would observe it as going down. Right? So you have to control for that. That's really what we're talking about, is what kind of controls are there such that we can eliminate those as potential variables to explain our observations. And so they said, no, really, the amount of miles that we've traveled has been fairly similar. You can see there's quite a bit of change, but there's no specific, there's no trend, strong trend. Like we traveled a lot fewer miles, right? So that's why there's less roadkill. They also didn't travel a lot more miles, all right? Unlike there's just more total people in the area. So they couldn't say that it's just because we're not able to observe. And it turns out they've had the same employees, over 30 years. And they had the same individuals who were counting and measuring the wing lengths. So the same individual measured all the wing lengths of all these different birds, both from the population and from the roadkill. And so you can't say that it's even variation of like we replaced somebody over time and they measured things a little bit differently. I mean, after all, we're only talking about a millimeter, a couple millimeters here. That's really important. And so consistency of the person doing the measurements. What about some other variables? Right? Could predators and scavengers have increased over time? So you would say, what about hawks? Hawks can catch, all right, swallows and kill them. And maybe birds with shorter wing lengths can get away from hawks more easily. And so therefore, that's why the wing length overall average has gone down in the population. And so only the birds that have the longer wing lengths are going to be more easily caught by hawks. That doesn't really explain the cars, right? But nonetheless, it might mean that maybe that's changed the behavior of the ones with the long wings because they're more concerned about hawks. And so they're on the roads for some reason. I don't know. None of that really makes sense biologically. However, they want to eliminate that variable. Well, here's the thing. There are no more, the number of hawks seem to be about constant. All right. So that can't be the reason for any changes. And besides, we already know the population sizes have increased greatly over time. All right. So even if there was an increase in predator populations, it hasn't knocked down the population of swallows. What about scavengers? This could be important because if you're picking up roadkill, there's a lot of other organisms that might want to pick up roadkill too, right? There's going to be other organisms like, hey, there's a dead animal. I'll eat that thing, right? So there you have turkey vultures, right? And hawks. Well, what about dogs and cats that are in the area? It turns out this is not a very populated area. Oh, and the other thing is the number of individuals that lived in the county has been almost constant over 30 years. And so they take that as a rough estimate that there's probably a similar number of cats and dogs. But you can imagine if there was a lot more cats over time or a lot more dogs, then what could be happening is cats and dogs have seen roadkill and they've picked it up before somebody else could see it and pick it up and count it. So what they're arguing here is they're saying we looked for reasons why roadkill might be disappearing faster than we expect. Now they expect that there are scavengers out there and they are taking away roadkill. So what they're saying is we traveled the same number of miles. We've used our eyes for about the same amount of time. And so what we're really seeing is we're seeing recent roadkill, all right? Recent birds that have been killed. And as long as we've looked the same amount of time, we expect to find the same amount if roadkill's happening at the same rate. Unless there's more scavengers, right? If there's a lot more scavengers, then they're going to get more of it a little bit sooner and we're not going to see as many. Well, there's the same number of vultures, the same number of hawks. It seems like the same number of dogs, same number of cats. They can't find any trends in anything that might be like taking away the roadkill at a faster pace. So all of that suggests that, once again, the roadkill they're finding is a real result, that they really are just observing there is fewer birds being killed by automobiles over time, over 30 years, a drastic decline in the number of roadkill. Could there be competing birds, right, that maybe are stressing out the population? Like there's larger populations of other birds and they're taking away all their prey. And so maybe that makes these swallows sit on the road more because maybe that's where they can find food. They can't find as much food over the fields. And so maybe they become more aggressive, right? They have to stay a little bit longer. They have to there's other competing birds out there, and that other bird sees that thing on the road, and they see it on the road, and they're like, okay, that's some free food right there. We're both going to go get it. But then there's a car coming. One of them might be like, I'm going to die from starvation if I don't get that thing, right? So I'm just going to go for it, right? It's like, I'm going to be dead anyway. So stress can make organisms do things that you wouldn't think is in their best interest. Just witness human beings under stress, right? And the bad decisions they make. This happens to animals too. But no, it turns out other birds have declined in population, whereas the cliff swallows have increased in population. So although they're competing with each other, there should be just as much resource out there potentially. Although, caveat, one thing that I thought of that they did not discuss in this paper is the fact that you've probably heard about the great, the loss of insects, total insect biomass on Earth over the last 50 years. I suspect this part of Nebraska probably hasn't experienced quite the loss that, say, like England or other places that have high population, like high numbers of humans, especially using lots of different chemicals, that has really dramatically lowered the number of insects in our environment. But nonetheless, there could be a reduction in the number of total insects. If there's a reduction in the total number of insects, then what would happen? In my mind, I started thinking, well, that means you're not going to have as many insects in being hit by cars, in which case you're not going to have as insects on the roads. And if you don't have as many insects on the roads, what don't you have? You don't have as many swallows sitting on the road. All right, so you don't have as many opportunities to kill the swallows, even if there's a lot of swallows around. I thought that was a pretty clever hypothesis, and that might result. I think that hypothesis should be tested, and it could be a reason why there's fewer roadkill. But what it would not explain, all right, that really would not explain why the roadkill have longer wing lengths than the ones that than the rest of the population. Right? Let that sink in. The roadkill have longer wing lengths. That's the killer piece of data in this study. Why would there be a difference in the roadkill value versus the average population? What this suggests is there are a lot of swallows sitting on the road. Even if I'm right that there are fewer swallows on the road, there should be representatives of the whole population, right? Ones with short wings, ones with medium length wings, and one with longer wings. And what's happening is the ones with the longer ones are the ones being killed, right? So it's not just that only long-winged birds are sitting on roads. And now that's going to be hard to test, but somebody would have to come along and they would actually try to catch a whole bunch of birds they observed actually sitting on roads and see, is there a bell-shaped curve? Right? Is there small, medium, and large, with medium being like the most common length of wing? And then over that same area, over time, you're like, but okay, so there's like every wing length that's actually represented as being on the road, but only the long wing length birds are the ones that are dying. And so you can see why they have reached the conclusion, or I'll say they've reached the consensus in their mind that the best explanation for their data is that long wing length birds are dying at a higher proportion than any others. And as a result, that's causing a change and a shift in the overall wing length of the entire population, right? Because you're removing the genetic component that says have long wings, and therefore the genetic component of the birds that say have shorter wings is becoming more common. All right, that's another way of saying the allele frequency for long wings is getting reduced. The allele frequency, the number of those variants for short wings, is increasing in the population over time, and that's changing the characteristics of the population such that there are fewer and fewer birds with long wing lengths, and as a result, there's fewer and fewer birds being killed, all right, by cars, because most of them are able to escape now. And if we say that, and we say it in that way, then what we can conclude from that is that, in fact, the population has changed over time, right? It has adapted to the presence of cars by shifting its morphology, shifting its phenotypic features. All right, so all of this, to put this in a broader perspective and sort of talk about natural selection, what we're witnessing here, what's proposed we're witnessing, is something called directional selection. All right, and directional selection is the effect where you have, in this case, we're drawing out this orange line represents the observed value for some characteristic. That characteristic could be, in this case, wing length. You've got some individuals that have very short wing length. You have some that have very long wing lengths, and then you'll have some kind of average. It's the same thing as like saying in the human population, there's an average height, right? And a lot of people are that average height, but there's some people that are much, much taller. But there are very few people that are 7 feet tall, right? But there's a lot of them that are 6 feet tall. And so that represents the overall population variation, right? The populations have certain variance in the population, and depending on how they're mixed within a certain individual, that individual will either be very short, or be very tall, but most likely they've got some combination of alleles or variants that say be short, some that say be tall, and you're kind of some sort of average. All right, so wing length, same type of thing. I'm sure if you measured 1,000 birds in that population, they have some average, but there are some with longer and some with shorter. And so if what happens is you come in and you select, and this figure doesn't do it the right direction because we're actually going the opposite direction, we're going smaller. Let's just say down here is small wing length, and over here is large. That's just the way we've set up the data, okay? Can't write. All right, so in this original population, you had some average. And I think we're saying that's 109, or let's say 110. I think that was the data. 110 millimeters. And that's measuring just the right wing from edge to tip, from connection to tip. And then what happens is you have large ones are being killed, right? You know, even ones that are like over here, they're being smacked by automobiles in this new environment. Remember, before the this has probably been happening all the way up to 1984. But the notable thing about the 1980s is in this particular county, they built a whole bunch more overpasses and provided a lot more opportunities for the birds. Also, the other cool thing here is that the cliff swallows, although there's been human structures around for a while, they've only in the last 30 to 40 years started to really start using human structures. So it's not like up popped a human structure and all of a sudden cliff swallows just jumped on it and said like, awesome, we're going to use that. They've actually changed their behavior, but it's taken some time. All right, so that also suggests that they genetically have changed as well, because behavior is often going to be connected to genes too. All right, so there was originally populations of cliff swallows, and we built infrastructure, and cliff swallows didn't automatically just start using all kinds of human edifices for their nest, right? They're skeptical of those places, right? You build where you're used to building, and you have an eye for a particular location that works best and is best for your survival because that's the way it's always worked in the past. But very slowly over time, there are probably variants within that population. Some birds were a little more like, I'm a little more, I'm a little more willing to explore other options, right? They're the black sheep of the population, right? They have the different ideas, right? And you're like, well, look at that overpass over there. If I build my nest underneath there, I'll be protected from the elements. Now, I'm anthropomorphizing here, probably not thinking about that, but they do see it as a potential source, a place to nest. They nest there, they survive. In fact, maybe they survive better because they are protected from the elements. It's not as windy. Well, they don't have any rain, so it's not going to melt their mud nest, and so maybe they have a bunch of offspring, and now those offspring kind of have the same kind of genetics. that their parents have that built a nest there. And also there is such a thing as parents actually teaching young, right? And so in birds, parents bring up the young in many cases of birds, and they're basically teaching them behaviors. So you pass the behavior down from generation to generation. And so over time, you become more willing and more adapted, right, to living in these new environments. Okay, back to this. All right. I'm just trying to demonstrate these birds have already been on their way to adapting to human influences. And now here come automobiles. And as they have variation in the population, the large ones are being killed. If the large ones are being killed, then they're less likely, right? If you're dead before you reproduce, you can't pass down your whole bunch of long wing length genes. But the small ones, they're doing really great, right? They're able to survive in that environment with the automobiles. And so all of these birds in this population are all surviving and having offspring. What's going to happen? The average wing length will shift toward the smaller wings. And so what you'll have is, this is the peak, right? The peak now is 108 millimeters, right? It's 2 millimeters less. There's still variation within the population. There are still individuals that have long wings because you're going to recombine a bunch of different alleles, and once in a while you're going to pop out an individual that has a longer wing. Unfortunately, that one with a longer wing also has a greater chance of dying and is less fit in that particular environment. And what you do have is you have more individuals with shorter wings over time. All right, so we saw that. Let me get rid of this. Right, we saw that. We see that directional selection here. We see the longer wing lengths, the long wing length span that was the average early on in populations has decreased. But now you really have to ask yourself, why was it originally longer, right? Why were there a lot of individuals that had longer wing length? Well, there are advantages to having longer wing length, right? I'm sure there was a reason why the average in the population was longer than it is today. And so this allows me to, I'm trying to explain how complex natural selection can be, because it's not selection on a single trait. Natural selection operates on the whole individual. In this case, what we're saying is the length of the wing, because of automobiles, is potentially a very important trait, and it's having a strong influence on their survival. Stronger than the other forces that they have on their survival. You may think, well, what other forces? Imagine you're a bird that needs to fly all the way south into Mexico, and then you're going to fly back the next year. Maybe having a little bit longer wings makes that travel a little easier. You lose a little bit less energy. And so by now shortening your wings, what happens? You have to expend more energy on that trip the next year. That's a disadvantage, right? There's only so many resources out there. If it's really cold, if there's a huge storm, you have to expend extra energy. There's always a bunch of birds that die during those types of events. Which ones are going to die? Potentially the ones that have the shorter wing length. The ones that have the longer wings may actually make it through something. They may get farther south a little bit quicker, although they tend to group together. But nonetheless, they're the ones that maybe are expending a little less energy. They have a little more body fat. They survive the cold. And their neighbor that has a shorter wing dies. Right? Well, then you would turn around and tell me, well, wait a second, but short wing length has negative fitness. It's actually bad for the birds. But now you're trying to tell me that short wing length has an advantage for the birds. I'm going to tell you, yes to both. It's true. Every characteristic is both a positive characteristic and a negative characteristic. So what really matters? It's the strength of the selection that's happening. So if cars are knocking out birds right and left, and you have a long wing length, and that gives you a significant chance, and significant could be, you have a 1% greater chance than your neighbors of being killed. That's actually a very large difference in terms of a population of hundreds of thousands, because it means that there's going to be hundreds or thousands more birds with long wing lengths, they're going to die than otherwise, even if it's a small difference in terms of their overall chance of survival in that event. All right, so that's the selection that's happening there. Right, so if the selection by cars on the population is stronger than the selection by the environment, say in their travel for going down south, then what's going to happen is the wing length's going to get shorter. Now, if you went through a bunch of years where like the climate changes and these birds are really struggling, there's not enough food, the insects are almost gone, maybe the most important thing might be having longer wing lengths because that gives you better survival. All right, maybe that would be enough of an advantage. You'd be like, I'd rather take my chances with the cars. Again, I'm speaking anthropomorphically. That's not what the birds are thinking. What's happening is you have 100,000 birds. Some of them have longer wing lengths, some have shorter. And although some of them are being killed by automobiles, more short-length birds are dying on the trip down to Mexico. And as a result, what is the net outcome? The net outcome is that the average length of the bird's wings is going to get longer because the offspring are more likely going to come from longer winged birds. And they're going to pass their genes down preferentially to the next generation. Right? So what we're saying is there are 100 different forces out there, and each one is pushing on this bird in a different direction. In order for us to see natural selection happening in the environment and see adaptation, typically what has to happen is there has to be a very strong force enticing a particular characteristic to be the winner in a new environment. In which case that force, that natural selective force, is trumping all the other forces that are maybe actually pushing the organism in a different direction, right? Every organism is being pushed in 100 different directions, but the net effect is the population will change toward wherever the overall fitness of the population and overall fitness of an organism is better. And that's the thing about changing environments, right? Any organism, any population, got to get away, can't say organism, any population that's living in an environment that is experiencing some kind of dramatic change is going to see that change affect the individuals in that area, and certain characteristics are going to be selected over others. And that's where we're going to see these types of effects occur. Let's address one other point real quick before I sum this up. You still might be saying to yourself, maybe this is learned. Something about this is a learned behavior. Maybe birds are watching other birds and they see them getting killed, right? And we're just addressing the question of not the length of the wings. We're just thinking about this question of why are there fewer roadkill? It seems pretty evident, and this is not the only study, by the way, that has suggested there's lower roadkill of birds despite increasing populations. So maybe you could say birds are watching other birds and they see what happens, right? You know, younger birds are watching and they see other birds being killed. And so they learn from that not to cross over roads, to make sure you leave a little bit earlier, not to wait to the last second, right? It's a learned behavior. If it was a learned behavior, then what we'd expect is we'd see more juveniles being killed because they haven't learned the behavior yet, right? And in fact, what happens is the data suggests that's not the case at all, that they're all adult birds that are being killed. So the juveniles already know not to get near the road, right? So that doesn't seem to be a learned behavior. That seems to be an innate behavior. Either that or the juveniles are just that much better at leaving. They get scared more easily. Like, well, there's a car way off in the distance, and they leave right away. You see this with crows all the time. They are amazing at judging just how much time they have, right? They'll come right back, and they only leave at the last second. They know their capacities. They know their abilities. And so if it was, like I said before, if it's a learned behavior, you'd expect that they would find juveniles in their roadkill, but they don't find juveniles in the roadkill. They're adults. And so these are adults that have long, and then they look and they say, oh, wait a second, there's this long wingspan thing. All right. So these birds have the same behavior In other words, they all think alike, probably. They all think, oh, I have this much time, not realizing that, oh, I have a shorter wing length versus this other bird has a longer wing length, but they both think they have the same amount of time in order to leave the road. And so as a result, they both jump up and try to leave, and one of them escapes and one doesn't. Right? That's why they conclude that this really is evidence that natural selection is the selective agent is the car, and the car is really actually causing a change in the genetics of the population in the wingspan, because we actually observe that wingspan difference, and it makes sense. All right? From an aerodynamic standpoint, it makes sense what's happening here. Oh, and that reminds me of one other little tidbit. They looked at the type of cars. And so you might also, well, maybe cars have changed and they're less likely. Maybe they're more aerodynamic, and as a result, they're not killing as many birds. But in fact, even though cars have become more aerodynamic, there were more trucks, and there were a lot more SUVs, all right, and trucks with big grills, and also the average speed at which people drive has increased in the area. So when you combine all those things, the population's getting larger, the trucks and the automobiles are getting larger, the speed at which they're driving is getting faster. Their predators aren't any more common than they were before. It really is remarkable that they find less roadkill over time. And to find this evidence that the birds actually have physical differences between the ones that are killed and the average population is really compelling evidence that they are seeing natural selection in action. Now, this isn't a controlled study in the sense that this is done in a lab and we can control all the environmental factors. But they've thought of as many possible environmental confounders as they could and tried to study all of those and see if they could explain their data. And what they conclude at the end is none of this other data can explain why we see a difference in wings in wing length. I found it pretty compelling, right? I found it to be very compelling evidence, because I can't think of anything either that would explain this difference other than there is a real effect going on genetically, that certain genes are being selected over others. All right, so that's an example of natural selection, like out there in the real world. We're actually observing it happening. So thanks for hanging out with me. That is I think a real world example of seeing natural selection, the effects of natural selection happening on real populations. It's messy business. It's so much easier to show how natural selection happens in a lab where you can control all the different variables. But in the real world, you have literally hundreds of variables occurring. You have hundreds of things interacting with organisms all the time. And remember, the environment can change. Right? What happens if all of a sudden there are no cars in that part of Nebraska? Right? Maybe if there was a pandemic and all of a sudden people didn't travel for 5 years, right, in this one county, and the swallows didn't see any cars for that long, so there wasn't any roadkill. What would you predict happens? This might be a question I would ask to my class, right, as a test question. Like, what would you predict will happen over the next 5 years? Well, I would predict that they would reverse the trend. I think there's an advantage to having longer wing lengths, right, given there's no automobiles, right? It appears that the natural population prior to automobiles was having longer wing lengths, and I believe there was probably a reason for that, right? And it probably has to do with long distance travel and energy efficiency. But nonetheless, the force of automobiles seems to be strong enough that it's saying that despite the value of having a longer wing length, it's not nearly as valuable as having a short wing length for your overall survival, right? So now you take away that particular variable, and all of a sudden you've switched around which organism is more fit. The birds with longer wing lengths are going to be, they're going to have higher fitness. Higher fitness just means that they are more likely to survive and more likely to have more offspring. And as a result, the next generation is going to have shorter wings, right? Because they have an advantage over the ones that have they're going to have longer wings because they're going to have an advantage over the short-winged birds. And if that continues on for a period of years, it might take 20, 30, 40 years to get it back to what the population was in terms of average wingspan. There's also the length of the tail feathers, and there's a bunch of other characteristics too that we're not getting into, but those have slight changes as well. So it's all about the aerodynamic abilities of these birds. And so you would expect that trend would reverse. And so when we talk about directional selection, we're not talking about like some sort of force that will continually and forever push a bird or a particular organism in a particular direction, that characteristic in that direction. It's only as long as that particular environmental factor holds sway and is most important for survival, then those organisms are going to adapt and change genetically to become better fit with respect to that particular characteristic, right? That particular variable, environmental variable. But if that particular environmental variable changes, the organism could very well go back to the way it was before. Or there's a new environmental variable, which is even more important, and it begins to push it in a different direction, right? There could still be cars, but maybe there's a lot more airplanes flying around, all right? Probably going to have the same effects in that case. But I don't know what it would be. But if there's some other environment, well, I know what it could be. It could be that the environment grows much colder. All right, if it grew much colder, you had much larger storms. You had some cold snaps even after they've migrated up there. Larger birds or birds that are able to protect themselves a little bit better are going to have a better chance of surviving. And that could be enough pressure that would overcome the automobile pressure. All right, I'm belaboring the same point over and over again, but it's a really important point because so often students, and certainly the general public, has this perception where they hear stories about a single trait and a single characteristic, and here's how it changes. And it's like, yes, okay, that's how it changes. But you have to understand natural selection is working on an entire organism, all the features combined. And that's a really complex thing that's hard to measure in the real world. That's why studies like this are pretty interesting, because you rarely get to see over just a span of 30 years the effects of changing the population genetics of a population due to a fairly obvious new environmental factor introduced into that environment. All right, let's wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.